I'm at the wrong, we're in the paperless world, and yet I've turned on the paper. That was fascinating, and I think it's very pertinent to see that the metaphor in particular was very interesting, and it explains, I think we can see that has happened in other technical developments, and the internet was the last development that had a similar curve. What I want to talk about is something slightly different. My name is Chris James, I'm a lawyer, I'm a practicing solicitor. I'm interested in technology law and practices technology, and the intersection between law and technology development. I'm a hobbyist app developer, so I keep up to date with what's going on in this space. And accordingly, I've been to a couple of different seminars in this space in the last few weeks. Firstly was hosted by UBS, and I think some of you guys were there as well, which was called a legathon, which is a term that I liked. And it was where technologists were exploring how we could use the blockchain within the constructs of our own legal system, how we could effectively become the banks and businesses that want to adopt this technology. And the second seminar that I went to was by the Society of Computing Law, and it was looking at the advances in technology through to superintelligence, and really how we keep people at the heart of that technology and how we stop the technology from running away with itself. And it strikes me you have these two respective groups of experts looking at the problem from different angles, the diametrically opposed angles almost. Those involved in the blockchain, they think, well, the legal system is a black box, potential threat, we just don't understand it. And those involved in the legal industry, or the regulatory sector in particular perhaps, are looking at this and seeing the blockchain as a threat, a black box, something that they need to control. But actually this is not about the law. This is about politics and political theory. Because the idea that the law can be used to hold back development of technology is often one that's couched in terms of decentralization, disintermediation, individual empowerment. These are kind of quite libertarian principles. And we've seen a resurgence in the rhetoric around this recently, particularly with Edward Snowden and the discussion of encryption technologies, and encryption is now a dirty word again without our government. And of course, this has happened once before, and we've seen legislation develop and adapt to this. We have, and I'm thinking specifically of the example of decryption keys and the fact that it's a criminal offence not to disclose to an authority your decryption keys if asked in the course of investigating a crime. And of course then there's another example, which is the regulation of cryptography as an arms internationally. And these are areas that the law has, the libertarian principles of the Wild West of the internet, and can be moved forward, and we can see the same debates happening with the blockchain. But there's two ways to look at this problem. We can look at it through the eyes of theory. And I know that's attractive for many of us who are kind of at the forefront of technology, and we're looking at it from a particular libertarian point of view. But I think what's interesting is, from the UBS session that we held, is actually, there's another way of looking at this, and that is, if with the businesses and the banks that want to come in and legitimise and mainstream this technology, what are our concerns? And that's a different set of concerns, actually. That is about creating an environment in which it's safe to do business. And what was fascinating about that session was that in a couple of hours we managed to articulate a system where we could use blockchain technology to facilitate an international trade. And just to very quickly summarise, and forgive me, I'm omitting a lot of detail here, but just to very quickly summarise what we came up with, it was a structure that relied on using smart contracts to record regulation. So the regulation was built into the smart contract. So for example, there could be a kill switch if the smart contract finds itself in Iran, because Iran is a blacklisted jurisdiction for securities trading. And of course, that is simply adapting existing regulation into a smart contract. And it treats smart contracts broadly similar to the way that we treat derivatives trading. They're simply contracts, legal contracts, that record rights passing. The only difference being instead of an external regulator telling you whether you can and can't execute it, it's doing it itself. The interesting point from a blockchain and from Ethereum perspective is obviously the value in a derivative is linked to some other asset, whereas the asset for this smart contract is recorded into, there's a metacoin, it's built into the platform itself and the blockchain itself. And that means, of course, that two things. One, it's actually easier to police that regulation. But two, to enable that to happen, the banks are, it might be very well regulated, it might not execute in Iran, but how do I actually convert it back to a fiat currency to make this a worthwhile business proposition? And that's the bit where the regulation comes in, and that's where the regulators are starting to get concerned. We can largely trade whatever we want on a private sphere amongst ourselves if we all agree with each other that a certain number of Ether or Bitcoins resembles a certain amount of value, then we're free to agree that amongst ourselves. It's only when we want to then turn that back into some real world fiat currency that the regulators start to get interested. We talked about another number of concepts, for example, regulating that part of the equation. For example, the regulators, central banks or maybe commercial banks, investment banks issuing currency pairs that are regulated, and those currency pairs have controls built into them. There's a number of different ways, and I know Sean's going to come on to how regulation, I think John's going to come on to how the regulation can kind of touch some of those issues. So I'm going to leave it at that, but my interest is more in the private side. As I say, we can agree on anything, so we don't need to go down that route. What we could do is we could say, we'll start off developing this technology, we'll find applications that don't touch those sensitive areas. So for example, trade finance might be a good example. That is a very inefficient process that requires on the value exchange, but it's entirely conducted within the private sphere. And that's an area that is light touch regulation. There are fewer regulatory hurdles to cross, and therefore, if you're building a business on top of the Ethereum or blockchain, you can start by looking for areas which are perhaps less heavily regulated, less butting up against those regulatory hurdles. Coming back to, how do we round this out? And I started off by saying actually the bigger questions, the libertarian questions, are actually philosophical questions. And how you run a society is something that is based in political theory, and part of that political theory overlaps with the law into jurisprudential theory, and that's the theory of law. And what is law? Why do we have it? And that's something which is also touched by this technology that we're creating. Because there's an author, a very esteemed law professor called Lawrence Lessig, who writes about law being code, and that you can codify some of these actions. And in a democratic society, that's what we do. We codify, we democratically decide the principles we're going to work to, and then we codify them. Now, democracy doesn't mean we all vote on it. What it means is there's a representative, there's a chain that might be direct, it might be representative, from the demos right through to the regulation. And that's one of the areas that we can start to codify into the blockchain. The SCL, Society for Computers in Law, that I talked about, was interesting because what we were looking at is how do you control artificial intelligence and the development of artificial intelligence into the singularity. And that's where having a technology that deals with distributed consensus and distributed trust, and more than that, has a control, i.e., the value is stored in the blockchain, so to continue to execute, the API is the blockchain, if you like. So to continue to execute, you still need to have right privileges to that API, that ecosphere, that database, distributed database. Means that you can codify some of our rules into that, and you can use those to control. As humans, we can put that onto artificial intelligence, and the artificial intelligence can live and breathe effectively within the rules that we created, something like Ethereum. So I think what we need to do is we need to, as pioneers in this space, what we need to do is say, well, how do we, on the first instance, find banal and easy to solve inefficiencies in trade and commerce that we can crack simply to prove this technology and show to people, yes, it is viable and it's something that will, just as the internet became the web of information and the exchange of information, TCP/IP became a global standard, that Ethereum can become, and its competitors, of course, can become a global standard in value exchange and consensus as a service. But then, as technology 10, 20, 30, 50 years down the line, as this technology develops, we can use this to start to shape the society we live in, and at that point, the regulation becomes embedded. And on that note, I think I'll hand over to Sharp, who will give us some insight into the regulation.